It was just the most instinctual thing that I was like, I'm applying to the Peace Corps. They say that as a Peace Corps volunteer, you're on 24/7 because you're living in a new culture. You're learning a new language. So it's not like you can step out your door and go down the street to a place that's familiar and just like take a load off. You're always kind of on and trying to learn and work on things. I have learned so much, and I'm in that stage of trying to integrate that into action that matters. There's so much else that brings value to something, like cultural value, not just the money. But the world that we live in, money is a direct representation of our values. So if we're paying more for one thing than another thing, we are directly valuing that thing more.
Welcome to The Human Experience. I'm Jennifer Peterkin, and this is episode 21, Kristen's Story. After completing their undergrad, Kristen decided to join the Peace Corps, going on to serve as a volunteer for 2 years in Ghana. Through their work with the Peace Corps and the experiences that followed, Kristen's future began to take shape. She is a global gender equity specialist and a passionate advocate for women worldwide. Kristen's resume is impressive and speaks for itself. But more than that, she has a deep understanding of the diverse issues women continue to face across different cultures, and she possesses an actionable empathy that creates space for change. You can read more about Kristen and their work in the show notes. And a disclaimer before we start, the content of this podcast is Kristen's alone and does not reflect the views of the U.S. government, the Peace Corps, or the Ghanaian government. Let's see, when did you go into the Peace Corps?
I went into the Peace Corps in 2014.
Okay.
I feel, whenever I talk about like how I got to where I am, I'm like, it is so not linear.
Yeah, but like that's the best part, right? Like whose is?
I'm learning that less and less people, or less than I thought, actually have linear paths. So you're right. It makes it interesting for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say with that is when I was an undergrad, I was studying math and engineering, and I thought that I was going to go into architecture. Went to visit some schools during my Thanksgiving break and was like, nope, don't want to work with an architectural firm, even though I like the process of this. And just like kind of on a whim, not on a whim, but like it was just the most instinctual thing that I was like, I'm applying to the Peace Corps. I had met a recruiter on campus and I went back home and I applied right away. I don't know. It was just one of those things that was like, this is the next step in my life. And I don't know if I've ever had that much clarity in any other step post that.
Wow. So did you finish your undergrad before you went?
I did. Yeah.
And did you finish in math and engineering?
So I was in the engineering school for 2 years, but then because of like a study abroad, I wouldn't have graduated on time. But my advisor, who was amazing, Joan Rosebush, helped me figure out that if I switched to a math major, I could graduate on time.
Wow.
So I graduated with a math degree.
That's really interesting. Like knowing what you do now, it's very interesting that that's what you went to school for.
Yeah.
So I did not go to the Peace Corps. What is the process like for getting into the Peace Corps?
That's a good question. And actually, I don't know if you know this or not, but I've also been a Peace Corps recruiter for the past 3 years. So
I didn't know that.
Perfect person to answer this question.
If I wanted to go into the Peace Corps, what do I have to do?
Yeah, the application process has changed over the years. So when I applied in 2013, it was the old application, which there was only one. You could apply to go anywhere. You could indicate if there were specific places that you absolutely would not go in the world or if you had a preference, but ultimately it's up to them. So they placed me in Ghana. If you're selected, you have to do like medical history. And there's a lot of misconception around that people think if I have certain illnesses or something, Peace Corps won't accept me, which is not necessarily the case. Of course, they don't want to put you in a situation that is not going to be healthy for you.
Sure.
Mostly that's like, okay, if you have certain medications you need that need refrigeration, like they got to consider that. They're not going to place you in a place that doesn't have refrigeration.
Yeah.
Then there is an interview process. And then if you're offered a position, you have about 72 hours to accept or decline that offer. And then from there, you got to go through all the medical prep, the immunizations, et cetera. And then there's some pre-departure modules that you do online, and then you depart. So the whole thing can take anywhere from like 6 months to a year.
Okay. just the process of getting approved.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you decline, will you get another offer? Or is that like, listen, if you're going to be picky about where you're going, then we're not going to keep offering you places?
I don't think that's necessarily the mentality. It's not like, oh, if you decline this for a specific reason, we won't consider you. But it is not advised because Peace Corps is so competitive. You know, obviously, if you have a really good reason that you're like, I can't go to this place, like that
sure,
you know, that makes sense. But for the most part, I would say Peace Corps encourages people to take the placement that's offered. That being said, I also did not touch on this. Sorry, I told you about the old application process, but there's also a new application process that they put into effect. It was actually the year after I went. So I think it was 2015. You can either do the old one where you apply to go anywhere, or you can apply for a specific position in a specific country.
Oh, wow.
So it is a little more tailored now. Like you do have a little more choice, but you also have an opportunity in that application to say, if I'm not chosen for this place, I'd like to be considered for elsewhere, which I would always recommend to people as well, because you want to keep your options open. You know, if that country fills up for some reason and they think you're a better fit somewhere else, you could still have an amazing experience and amazing opportunity somewhere else.
Yeah. I don't mean this to come off the wrong way, but why is the Peace Corps so competitive?
No, that's a great question. I think it's just due to the sheer number of applications, the limited amount of spots open. I know that the applications have been increasing over the years, although I couldn't tell you the actual statistics. I will say it was very interesting recruiting over the pandemic when there were no volunteers serving because they had to evacuate all the volunteers back to the U.S. So definitely there was probably a drop in numbers during the pandemic, but people could still apply during that time and their applications would just be on hold until they started getting some countries open, which there are volunteers back in the world now, which is exciting.
Okay, yeah. There seems to be a prestige with working with the Peace Corps. Is that true? It's like people want to specifically, if they're going to do humanitarian work, work through the Peace Corps. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, for sure. I find that people join the Peace Corps for a lot of different reasons. Definitely that's one of them. There's graduate school benefits, which I used. The technical term is returned Peace Corps volunteer. It means you've completed your 2 years of service. So once you gain that status, then you're eligible for the benefits that come afterwards. So graduate school benefits, it's called a Coro Fellowship. Schools across the country offer them in different programs. Every program offers like a different package. So it could be partial, full tuition, stipend, benefits. So that's great if you want to go back to school. That's definitely a driving factor for people. There's also, when you return from Peace Corps, you also have what's called non-competitive eligibility for a year, though there's talk about extending it for 2 years. And what that means is if you apply to any federal job, your application's basically taken and put at the top of the stack.
Wow.
So it's really great for people who want to go into work with some kind of federal organization in our country right after Peace Corps. Again, I didn't utilize that. I didn't apply for a federal job within a year of returning. So now I don't have that eligibility anymore.
Okay.
But if it's something that someone knows they want to go into that work afterwards, it is a foot in the door.
Okay. That's really interesting. And you actually answered one of my questions, which was how long the service is 2 years. Are you there the entire 2 years? Like you do not come home, you do not do anything else, like you are living there for the 2 years?
Yes. So they say that as a Peace Corps volunteer, you're on 24/7.
Oh, okay.
Because, you know, it's a technical like 40-hour work week, but you're on 24/7 because you're living in a new culture. You're learning a new language. So it's not like you can step out your door and go down the street to a place that's familiar and just like take a load off. You're always kind of on and trying to learn and work on things.
Sure.
But there's 2 days of vacation time that you get per month.
Okay.
And you can bundle those too. So if people want to take a longer vacation. So volunteers will do different things with that. You could travel within the country. You could just stay at your site. You could travel to another country surrounding your area. I was really lucky. My parents came to visit me.
Oh, wow.
And that's a really awesome opportunity if volunteers' family can come visit, because it's so unique for them to be able to see that kind of intimate part of another country. They actually got to meet my host family and an area of Ghana that you wouldn't really go to just as a tourist, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
So that is a really unique opportunity. Some volunteers would, if they had the funds or saved up for it, they would go back to the U.S. for something to see their family. But yeah, Peace Corps pays for your flight to the country at the beginning of your service and back at the end of your service. Anything in between that is on you, but you do get that vacation time.
Okay, that's cool. Mm-hmm. I honestly didn't even expect to ask you this many questions about the Peace Corps, but I'm like, actually, I don't know anything. It's so interesting to know how the system works.
Yeah.
But anyway, you signed up, you got accepted, and you went to Ghana. Mm-hmm. So you spent 2 years in Ghana. Did you spend more than 2 years there?
Just about 2 years. Technically, Peace Corps service is 2 years and 3 months. The first 3 months in country are your training.
Okay.
But actually, there's a little bit of flexibility with that in some cases. And in mine, because they had to stagger, like when volunteers were leaving the country, I had one of the earlier leave dates.
Okay. What were you doing in Ghana?
I was a junior high school science and ICT teacher. ICT stands for Information and Communication Technologies.
Okay.
So it was like their computer class, but we talked about all technology. I was originally selected to be a math teacher, but that is something that is a little flexible in a lot of different African countries where they are bringing math teachers in. They often work in science, or a lot of those countries also want us to work in ICT, even though I don't consider myself a tech guru, but I've had more access to technology in my life. And so in that regard, I did have more experience I could share with them.
Sure, that makes sense. Is that your job the entire 2 years?
Yes, that was my job the entire 2 years. It's called a primary project.
Okay.
So that's like what Peace Corps assigns you as your primary project. And there's different sectors. So I was education sector, but we also have in Ghana, like health volunteers and agricultural volunteers. There's different sectors that work in other countries as well. But then on top of that, your primary project, you can also do what they call secondary projects. And that's really just an opportunity for you to match your passions or your interests with a community need. So I worked on a few of those too that were kind of where my heart was really at, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I've already stated this, but I'm going to state it again. I've not done the Peace Corps, but I have traveled, and I have found that travel is the biggest window into who I am as a person, right? Like I've found the most out about myself and who I am through travel and through those experiences. So I can't even imagine the growth you experienced in your 2 years, because I've never been in any one place for that long. Can you talk about just your experience in Ghana and the culture and living there?
Yes.
All of it.
Yes. And I agree. So now I'm an applied anthropologist. I'm all about actually immersing yourself in a culture somewhere.
Yeah.
So I agree. I just think travel, or, it could even be right next door, but getting immersed in some culture is such an amazing way to learn and grow. I think, honestly, I was in Ghana from 2014 to 2016. Now we're in 2022, almost 2023. I still feel like I'm integrating the things I learned and am growing from during my Peace Corps experience. I think I'm still looking back at it and being like, okay, now I'm understanding something different,
Yeah. How was it living with your host family? I mean, was that your first experience doing something like that, living with another family?
Yeah. It was. For that period of time, yes. I did a service learning course in Costa Rica when I was in college that was 2 weeks. And we stayed with families for like 1 or 2 nights there, but not like this, I actually had more than one host family in Ghana. I had, a host family I stayed with during training. We all do our training in the same community, same village, and then we all go to our separate sites for the rest of the 2 years. So I have my host family in the training area, who I'm no longer really in touch with as much. But my host family at my 2-year site, I am still very much in touch with. It's another family. Ghana's another home. And a lot of my life right now is figuring out how to be there in the ways I need to be and want to be for my family here and my family in Ghana.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll just preface this. Peace Corps sends volunteers to not just anywhere in the country, but like the most marginal communities in the country that are facing some of, the most severe poverty and systemic barriers and things. Not always, but majorly, that's where Peace Corps volunteers go. So I lived in a community in the north of Ghana that was subsistence-based farming, purely agricultural. Where I lived, I had a 30-minute bike ride to my nearest market town where there were a few shops where I could get like toilet paper, which we called tea roll, and my food things in the week. But my community was all farmers.
Okay.
And it also was primarily not English speaking. They were speaking the local language, Dagare, which I learned with Peace Corps. Very rusty now. Nyele Dagare, Fifi. But as a teacher, we actually had to teach in English. They're really strict about it in the schools, that they have to speak in English when they're at school. They have to only do things in English. Feels very colonial. It's very frustrating. But there's a purpose. They have to standardize tests in English.
Okay.
So if they don't learn it, then they're at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
But in my community, the kids mostly were the ones speaking English. The kids and the teachers, like all the parents really didn't speak. They spoke Dagare. So for me, I was constantly learning Dagare the whole time I was there. I still feel like I wish I could reach a deeper level of it to have deeper conversations with some of the adults. But I feel like because of that, I really grew my relationship with some of the younger people. So I had a couple host little sisters, and they were the same ages as my nieces and nephew here in the States.
Oh, that's nice.
And so it was kind of like this immediate, oh, I know you in a way, you know? And so my host sister, the older one, we really got, I think, the closest out of anyone in me and my family. And I lost touch with her for a couple of years because she was young and she didn't have a phone when I left. Now she's got a phone. She loves it and social media. So, so now we're more in touch. And I actually got to go back and spend time with her when I was in Ghana for research last summer, 2021.
Oh,
and
awesome.
She's so much older and she's becoming a hairdresser. She braided my hair, which was
cool.
awesome.
Yeah.
And I tell this to people who want to go into the Peace Corps too. I learned so much, but I think one of the most important or like transformative things about Peace Corps for me was that I just gained so many deep relationships that totally have changed what I care about and think about in life.
Yeah. Your exposure to people in general will always be transformative, right? Yeah. So the more you push yourself outside of your bubble, the more you gain, because knowing other people on an intimate level is just one of the most rewarding things we can do as human beings. Education in Ghana where you were, was it a priority? Like, were the kids staying in school where you were? Was that a big thing?
Retention was definitely a hard thing in our community. And I think there's a lot of factors to that. That being said, I had a lot of students. I had a class of like 70. And a class of 50. So because we were the one junior high school for like a vast agricultural area.
Right. So like how far away are some of these kids having to come to go to school? Like, is that a big barrier, is distance?
Yeah, that is a really big barrier. And it's not one I focused on much during my service, but there are some really cool projects that are happening to deal with that. There's like a village bicycle project, like where they're trying to get more bicycles into communities. But one of my secondary projects, I did a needs assessment we had 7 sub-communities in my community. And I had what Peace Corps calls like a counterpart. So someone who lives in your community or knows your community who is there to like help you integrate and work on projects. And mine was wonderful. And he helped me go to all the 7 sub-communities and like introduce me when I first got there. They all gave me names in their local language, which is the thing. But then he also helped me go back to them to do a needs assessment. And my question for the needs assessment was, what will make education better in Kalsagri? Kalsagri is the name of the community. And so they came up with all the different things they wanted to do. And so like some of them touched on the point of it being, hard to access more for the primary level than the secondary level. So it was brought up, like we need a bridge over this river because our kids can't walk over it to the primary school. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what they voted on as the top priority, and this was like, all the parents and workers in the community that were voting, was to finish a computer and library project that they had going on at the school. It was actually an old building that they were renovating, and it was already started. So I'm kind of glad they chose that because it was kind of like, yeah, let's finish this project. The reality is there's so much to be done and just very few resources.
Right. Yeah. Where do you start?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. You left Ghana after your 2 years and you went to grad school, correct?
It was more winding than that.
Yeah, how about you tell me what you did and I stop guessing what you did?
No. I mean, that is what you said is true, but there was definitely a gap period in between. So I left Ghana in 2016, and honestly, I can't even tell you one thing I did from next to another because I get years mixed up. But like during the past several years before I went to grad school in 2019, I didn't go till 2019.
Oh, okay.
So it was 2016 to 2019. It had been my plan the whole time I was a Peace Corps volunteer to go to India instead of coming directly back and do my yoga teacher training, which was another secondary project I had in Ghana. I didn't have my teacher certification at the time, but I had been practicing yoga and I started a girls' yoga group that met at my house after school.
Amazing.
It was under a Let Girls Learn grant, which was an initiative started by Michelle Obama. So love her, So that was awesome because it was like, I think the best way that I could connect with the girl students in my school. I was the first woman teacher at my school. So they immediately were like, you are in charge of the Girl Child Club, which is a Ghana initiative for like helping girls with their periods and, like whatever they need during school. So I felt like the yoga group really helped me to bond with them outside of school. So it could be like, you can come to me.
Sure.
Things,
you can trust me. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting all sidetracked.
No. This is so interesting. Did you actually go to India and do your...
I did.
That's amazing. Yeah. I want to hear about that.
Yeah. I went to India directly after Peace Corps for 3 months, and I did 500 hours of yoga teacher training at 2 different schools. The first one was in Rishikesh. It was at Vinyasa Yoga School, which was awesome. The other people in my class were from all around the world, and we had several wonderful teachers. And that was a really awesome experience. And I'm still like, some of my best friends are people I was in that training with. So that was the first kind of like 200 hours. And then I went from that to one a bit further north in Dharamshala, which is the city of the Dalai Lama. Mm-hmm. And I went to Kailash Tribal School of Yoga and Holistic Healing, which was just one yogi teaching everything, doing everything, his Yogi Shivadas. And I'm still I follow him closely, and I really want to go back and like continue learning from him at some point. But that was just an amazing experience too. And I guess that was another one of those things. I don't know. Maybe I was just really, really sure of myself in my 20s. Like I was
you're
just like,
young
this
enough
is what I need to do. Like
you're young enough that you're like, I feel super confident about everything because I'm awesome.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It was like I guess now that I think about it, like I felt that way about going into Peace Corps. I felt that way about the yoga school too. I was just like, this is what I need to do now. And then after that, I was kind of like, I don't know. I didn't have anxiety, but I was like, I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And then anxiety crept in, and I was like, wait, what am I doing?
Wait a second. Yeah. So what did you do when you came home from India?
When I came home from India, I'm going to try to mishmash this all into like a few years of stuff that happened. And like, I don't even remember what order it happened in.
No worries.
But I taught yoga at a couple different studios in PA. I moved back near my family. I worked with a nonprofit called Arts Holding Hands and Hearts for a little while. What I did with them, I actually taught yoga at the boys detention center and girls shelter in Chester County.
Oh, wow.
So, and I loved doing that for a little while. That was an amazing opportunity to just get in there and offer this service that they don't have.
Sure.
And it comes with all the frustrations with the systems, but
of course, yes.
But so I did that. I drove Lyft for a while I was also teaching yoga to like supplement that. I've worked at different coffee shops. I worked as a wrangler for a summer in Colorado. I grew up riding horses and doing stuff with horses.
What?
So, yeah, I know. I'm all over the place.
That's all. I love it. This is fantastic. That's what life should be.
Right?
All these different things.
Guess I just can't sit still.
You are preaching to the choir here, so.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about your travels as well, for sure. We're going to have to talk about that over dinner.
Yeah, sounds good.
I moved to Arizona for 7 months because I thought that I wanted to go into nursing school and work with a specific Navajo nursing professor at University of Arizona, Michelle Kanjan, who is working to integrate some indigenous Navajo health practices into our healthcare system.
Wow.
And her work's amazing. Amazing person just in general, because she just like enriches you, you know. And
yeah.
I've been so lucky to have specifically women in my life that are like that everywhere I've gone. So her work's really great, but I basically came to the conclusion at one point. I was just like, nope, nursing's not it for me.
Yeah.
So
it's okay. You wouldn't have known unless you went, right?
Yeah. So I actually did certified nurse assistant training while I was there too.
Okay.
And I just decided I'm not going to grad school for it. And so then I moved back east to PA, my home base.
Yeah.
I was like, regroup, figure this out again. Taught yoga. I think I worked at coffee shops. I see, this is where I don't even remember what order things happened. But
No worries.
those years happened.
Yep, exactly. It all happened in some order. Yeah.
And at that time was starting to think about grad school a little bit, but didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I mentioned to you already that I did a 2-week service learning course in Costa Rica when I was a college student. I had an amazing opportunity where the professor who led that program reached out to me and was like, hey, we recently turned this 2-week service learning program into a semester abroad. Do you want to come work with us this semester as a program support assistant? He knew I had gone into the Peace Corps and we'd kind of kept in touch a little bit over the years. So it was an amazing opportunity that I went and worked with them for 7 months in Costa Rica. I worked with the students and I worked with the Costa Rican staff that we were working with as well. So I got to work on some of my Spanish language skills. I really love the program that he's doing there because it's all about community development and sustainability. So the students that he takes, they're actually environmental students for the most part, or with an interest in environment. But he does it from such a grounded community aspect where yes, it's bad that we have this pollution. Yes, it's bad that we have these things. But also, what about these systemic issues that we're seeing where people can't maybe afford to have the recycling program? I think it expands an understanding of that in such a foundational way to understanding just how we live in a really black and white polarized world right now where there's just a lot of emotion. But when it really comes down to it, most things aren't black and white. There's really complicated.
Yes.
So I feel like I was just really excited to be a part of his program because I thought that was what he was helping students understand.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Life happens in the gray all the time. What an amazing opportunity. That's just so cool to have not only traveled, but to have spent significant time in these places and communities. It's really valuable, really priceless. So that's amazing. You were there for a semester. But were you in school at that point or were you just working with them? Okay.
Yeah. So I was working with them and I was applying to grad school while I was there.
Okay.
And, Dave is the name of the guy who runs the program. He's great. Dave Kestenbaum. He was so supportive of me being like, I need to pop over into my house over here and try to get internet connection so I can have an interview for this, And so I was applying and that kind of came down to the wire too. I heard about anthropology from a friend of mine who was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. I had some conversations with her and was like, I think this is really what I want to do. And so I was applying for anthropology programs, but I applied to a couple other things too. I did a international development and technology program at Arizona State University that I also was considering, and applying for Coro fellowships, that fellowship tied to the Peace Corps that funds your work. Mm-hmm. And that was a really tough decision because they offered it to me at both places, but the anthropology program, I guess, because I would have been their first Coro Fellow at University of South Florida, I guess something happened with the budgeting and they wouldn't have had a stipend to give me. They could give me the tuition, but not the stipend. Okay. Whereas ASU could have done the whole thing. But I really wanted the anthropology program.
Yeah.
And so then it worked out that they figured out actually our campus Peace Corps recruiter position is opening up and you could potentially do that as your job and get your stipend from that. And that way we could offset it. I put some faith in it because I had to turn down the ASU one before I knew, but it worked out.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you got your master's, in anthropology.
Yes. Cultural applied anthropology. And I think a really distinctive part of that for me was that I got a grad certificate in women's and gender studies. And that's really where my focus is.
Yeah.
Through an anthropology lens, probably.
Okay. So explain what exactly led you to that, I guess. Why anthropology? What was the connection for you? I mean, I think some of it's kind of obvious, but just walk me through your thought process a little bit there.
I love learning from people in different cultures, as we've talked about already. And I think that anthropology really kind of offered me like a supportive community for doing that kind of work, like people who really believed in it, I think, and knowledgeable as well, who really knew how to like help me speak from that lens. And this anthropology program was always tied to, from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to go back and do my thesis research in Ghana. It wasn't broad spectrum. I just want to be an anthropologist and do whatever project. And in some ways, that really bit me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I was in grad school through the pandemic.
Oh,
and
gosh.
So, I had this plan to go over the summer for my research and nothing aligned. I didn't get the grant. And then it was the pandemic and they're like, well, you can't come anyways. So, But then I guess I was stubborn enough. I extended for an extra semester and I reapplied for the grant the next year. I didn't even think I was going to get it, and I got it from West Africa Research Association. Those stars aligned. Although that was down to like the very last wire too of being like, are you going to be able to give this to me or not based on the level of the country after the pandemic?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm blanking on the term right now. So it was all very much like nail biting to get there, but it got there. In
Amazing.
2021.
Yeah. So when did you graduate?
I graduated December 2021.
Okay. Wow. Almost a year ago.
Yeah.
I'm giving away the timeline here. I shouldn't be doing that. It's supposed to be timeless.
That's fine. That's fine.
No. You wanted to go back to Ghana. So why specifically? Like what was in your head? Like, this is what I want to research.
I think there were a couple components to that. First, as I explained in those years in between, I was all over the place. And I think I was just feeling like I've been so fortunate, but I've been so many places. I feel like I need to go back to some of the places I've been to learn more deeply. And Ghana was the first place, Ghana was like, I spent 2 years there. It's been the longest since I've been there. And on top of that, I had a specific project I was really interested in. And I still, getting ready for this interview, I was like, oh, I got to pull out my thesis and like prepare for this. They say you graduate and your thesis goes on a shelf. I hate it.
I worked so damn hard on this.
Yeah, I worked hard on it. But it's also like, I know I owe so much to the people that like gave their time for interviews and, I just am still figuring out, I guess, how it integrates into things. But sorry, long sidetrack. The project I wanted to go back for, I knew in Ghana, they have their what they call traditional government. And it's like the pre-colonial forms of government that are based on what the tribes do in the country, because there's several tribes. And I think across Africa, but I mean, I speak mostly about West Africa and specifically in Ghana because that's my experience. There's still a lot of clout for traditional government, even if it's not, heavily funded or recognized nationally. Like on the community level, people really still defer to their traditional leaders for certain things. And so my community was pretty patriarchal. We had a chief in the north, which I don't want to perpetuate that stigma. People say that it's more patriarchal in the north of Ghana and more matriarchal in the south of Ghana. I am actually pushing back on that and saying that might not be true, like historically.
Okay.
Or historically. But nowadays, that is mostly true, though changing. So anyways, I lived in the north in a more patriarchal area, but I was aware of the fact that the south of Ghana, there were a lot of matriarchal traditions. And the way that matriarchy works in Ghana, it's been described as like a dual sex political system. So it's not what we would think of as the direct opposite of patriarchy per se. It's not like, oh, just the woman's in charge. It was more that for every level of authority, there was both a woman and a man. Oftentimes, the woman would deal with issues that pertain more to women, or the man would deal with issues that pertain more to the men. So there's still a lot of queens in Ghana at different levels of authority. And I use the term queen in solidarity with one of the queens who I interviewed who alerted me to potential colonial ties to the term queen mother, which is still widely used throughout West Africa and Ghana. Like a lot of queens will still refer to themselves as queen mothers and like the queen mothers associations. But one of the queens I spoke to actually was trying to, she told me this story. She was like, do you know where the term queen mother came from? And I was like, no, please tell me. I'm really curious.
Yeah.
And she explained it as they were always queens, and that it was the British, because Ghana was colonized by the British, who changed the term to queen mother because they didn't want any Ghanaian queens to be at the level of the English queen.
Oh.
So I don't know how like historically accurate that is, but you know what? I am going to go with...
tracks.
Yeah. And, just I think part of my philosophy too is like putting trust in women around the world who so often we've been telling to prove themselves in some way, but giving them less resources to do it. So for me, I think it's not even a question of like, is this historical fact or not? It's like, I'm going to align myself with someone who's been disenfranchised.
Yeah. This is their experience. And I'm not going to sit here and like argue the merits of that.
Yeah.
And were you aware of this while you were in the Peace Corps, or is this something that you became more aware of later after you started on your anthropology journey?
Yes, I was aware of the matriarchies and the patriarchies in Ghana to a pretty good extent. Like Ghanaian trainers that work for Peace Corps taught us about it. I knew because I had friends who lived in the south of Ghana in more matriarchal communities, and they worked with their queens. And I worked with the chiefs in my community because that's who our traditional leaders were. We did have one queen in a sub-community, but I rarely saw her. And it's a newer now thing. It might be historical in the north, but it's coming back more in the north now. So there's not as many queens in the north right now. But I knew actually the Akan is the tribe or people group in Ghana that makes up about 50% of the population. So they're the biggest group, mostly concentrated in the south, and they are traditionally matriarchal. So traditionally, I would say more than 50% of Ghana is matriarchal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's so different from what we know, obviously, being in patriarchal society. So is that kind of what sparked your interest in going back there for research?
Yes. I could go way back. It could be like family, high school. What are the things that led me to the realizations that we need more women leadership in our world? But I think just knowing that was out there, and that it was still happening, and there was still so much to understand, and that it was a very understudied thing. I knew that I had connections I could pull in on and try to start interviewing some of those queens, and I had the things that would help me start that project. And I was just so curious about like what we could do with that. And ultimately for me, a really big part of it was also like, I feel like I grew up with this narrative that African women are so disempowered or so poor, and like we need to go help them and all these things. And then when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was like, that's not my experience. Like in some ways, yes, because of our modern systems, our modern, dare I say, capitalist systems really put women at a disadvantage around the world. But I don't think that's due to their traditional government. Yeah. And I think a big part of the project was wanting to help change that narrative and help us realize that we have so much to learn from people around the world too. Like America's the greatest country in the world. I love my country. I am now trying to get involved in potentially legislation and politics because I want to affect change. Yeah. Because I care about what happens in my country. But I don't fall in line with the America's the greatest country in the world. I think that every country or area, because now there's this discussion more and more about transnational dialogue. One of my favorite women and gender courses was transnational feminisms, where we talked about feminisms that cross borders. Because what are countries really? The borders were just set up in a day.
And they've been drawn and redrawn and...
Yeah. So just this idea that we are not at the top. We have privilege and advantages and things, but I think there's so much dialogue that can happen and cross-cultural communication and understanding, and which you've talked about your travels being such like a facilitator of growth. So I'm sure you understand, but just wanting to like share that story and have it be more heard in some way.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think American exceptionalism is one of the biggest disservices we do to ourselves as a people. And unfortunately, I think that it perpetuates the idea that everywhere else is bad and unsafe. And so you have Americans that will not leave the country because they're afraid of what else is out there. And it's like, you're missing out. There is so much depth and it's so rich. It's so culturally rich everywhere else. And that's not to say that America is bad, but to sit there and say that we are the greatest or we have something that other people don't. Well, okay, maybe in, monetary value, sure. But culturally, we always have something to learn from other people, right? Like that's never not going to be the case.
Yeah. And actually, on that vein, I'll give you a little side story. There's definitely some fear mongering. And if we're talking about Africa, specifically around health, I was in Ghana when the Ebola scare happened. It's so well intentioned, but the amount of family friends that would reach out and be like, are you okay? We're worried about you. What's going on? Ghana didn't have like a single case of Ebola. They handled it really well. My response was like, the U.S. has more cases than we do here,
Right.
Granted, we were next to countries that were really hit hard.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, what is just so misportrayed in like media.
Yeah.
And I'm not a health expert. I have a Peace Corps volunteer friend who's now an epidemiologist, and she might kick me if she hears this podcast and I say something that's not true. But, there are some bad diseases. I had malaria while I was a Peace Corps volunteer. It's awful. It's particularly awful for children under 5 and pregnant women who are really likely to die from it. So yes, it's a terrible disease. But I think in a way it gets so blown up out of proportion compared to diseases we have here, like Lyme disease. Disease is a global thing. And if there is a problem with it in a certain part of the world and not another or more so, why is that? First of all, what do we need to look at? Like, what resources don't they have? But also, like, how ingenious they can be with the resources they do have. I think during the pandemic, Senegal was the first country to come out with like dollar testing kits.
Wow.
Just amazing responses. And I think it's just, there's so much misperception around it.
Yeah. And it's something that you're more comfortable with as somebody that has traveled. Like even not going to a specific country, if I were to tell you about an experience I had, you wouldn't be like, that doesn't track with what I know about travel or the world or people. And it is just such a beautiful view of humanity to be able to see there's such vast differences, right, in humanity and our cultures. But there's something that always bridges those gaps. And it's just such a, I don't know, I feel like I can't overstate how important it is or how valuable it is to have those experiences.
I totally agree. I think more than ever, it's really important because I think taking ourselves out of our ordinary everyday situations and putting ourselves into the situation of someone else for a day, a month, a year, 2 years. Because, I was in Ghana for a long time, 2 years, but I'm not Ghanaian.
Right.
I still was like placing myself in that position with the knowledge that I was going to come back and this is a really hard thing to grapple with, but have more opportunity than a lot of people I worked with in some ways. There's also the part of me that's like, I just want to live in Ghana for so many reasons,
Sure.
So, like there's so many great things everywhere. But yeah, I think just taking ourselves out of that, and it's, the adage of like walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I feel like we're really struggling with that right now. And just being able to put on someone else's eyes to see like, why do I believe this? If I'm going to be blunt, why am I voting for this policy?
Yeah.
Like I see how it affects me, but am I thinking about how it affects other people?
Yeah. And I do appreciate you said earlier, you don't have to go to another country. There are other people in your community, because I do want to acknowledge too, as much as I talk about travel, it is a privilege to be able to travel, and not just monetarily, but like visas. Being an American, we can get a visa pretty much anywhere. Like that is not a problem. And that doesn't work both ways. And so to have that privilege to be able to do that and to say like, I want to learn and I want to experience this culture and I want to kind of walk beside them. And I think that is amazing and can be such a fruitful experience, but there is privilege there in being able to walk out and actually do it. But I do think it's important, regardless of where you are, step outside of yourself, step outside of your bubble and try to relate to other people that you don't necessarily think you have anything in common with.
Totally. And yes, like literally down the street. And honestly, that takes me to where I am right now. I have my thesis on my lap right now. It's not going away. I'm going to do something with it.
Please,
like,
do it.
Like I'm going to find a way. But I mean, my immediate focus is local. I'm currently in a Coro Fellowship for Public Affairs in Pittsburgh, and I'm working in local government, nonprofits, innovation and business sectors, trying to figure out like where I can have the most impact in society here. And a lot of that is the same thing as what I did in Peace Corps, taking myself out of my perspective and putting myself in someone else's perspective, literally right down the road from me.
Yeah. I don't think I actually asked you specifically, what was your thesis?
Yeah. No worries. I will read the title for you.
Please do.
It's Listening to Queens, Ghana's Women Traditional Leaders as a Model for Gender Parity.
Wow.
So in a nutshell, I did 22 in-depth, semi-structured interviews with queens across Ghana, and they were in different regions. And then I did key informant interviews with some family or lineage heads, and this is getting into some of the nitty gritty, but like how queens are elected, for lack of a better use of a term. It like includes the family heads, so that's why I was talking to them. Mm-hmm. One man chief, because there are also women chiefs in Ghana. That's another thing. And the one interview I did with the woman chief was really, really interesting too.
So what's the difference between a queen and a chief then?
That's a great question. I don't know that I got a definitive answer across the board. Also, like, I think queenship is practiced differently across Ghana in different communities.
Sure.
So I don't know that there's really an across the board definition for anything. They do have some things in common. And there are coalitions. Like more and more, it's exciting because they're trying to gain more national power. And so they are coming together as associations across the country. But generally, there's more men chiefs, women queens. They might deal with different issues in the community. One of the main differences that is kind of easy is like mode of election in traditional matriarchies, ones that aren't in the North. Some communities that might have been traditionally patriarchal are now like implementing queens. They might not follow this mode of election. But traditional matriarchies, the next queen would be selected by the family heads. And they're from a royal family, but it's not how we think of it in like England. Mm-hmm. It's like in Ghana, that's like extended family, and it's a lot of people. So it could be like your aunt or your uncle or like this cousin. And it's not hereditary in the sense that it just passes from one to the other.
Okay.
So the family heads, the elders of the family, which are both men and women, would choose the next queen when a new queen needs to be chosen. And then that queen has to have the final say on who the next chief is when the chief needs to be elected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest differences. Among that, people might say that queens deal with a lot of issues that pertain specifically to women. So like I focused in my thesis on what some of their political powers were, their social powers, their economic powers. I honestly focus more on queens. I couldn't tell you quite as much what the roles of chiefs are. But for queens, they're known for peacekeeping in their communities. They do conflict resolution, which is really interesting. Actually, the woman chief was kind of adopting this scenario because this is all unpaid work in the communities now because of the way that the national systems were set up. They privilege chiefs and not queens. It's really interesting. It's in the Ghanaian Constitution, the Chieftaincy Act.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But the woman chief did a alternative dispute resolution certification. And so she's doing the same work she would do otherwise, but now she can get some kind of monetary gain from it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So there's that. Social powers, they expand networks. They have authority on public health issues in their communities and community development. And then economic was really where they're struggling now. And that is, again, if we're talking about the Constitution, because the chiefs were essentially codified into the Ghanaian Constitution and the queens weren't, they now have a national budget and the queens don't. So that means they have their meeting buildings, they have their vehicles, et cetera, and the queens don't have any of that.
Wow.
So I would say the monetary things have shifted to disenfranchise queens.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it.
Yeah.
What an incredible learning opportunity. And I've not been to Ghana, so I don't have that experience. I never would have thought of something like that. And you know, conceptually that matriarchy exists, but we don't talk about it.
Yes.
So to actually see it in practice is very foreign for us.
And that's totally interesting. There are many feminists, actually, transnational feminists, who are arguing that it is more widespread than we have allowed it to be talked about.
Ooh.
And that comes back to who writes the history.
Uh-huh.
And I have a very specific example actually in my thesis of how that went down in Ghana. But, I've read there are a lot of Native American communities that are traditionally matriarchal, South America, around the world, really. And we're just not hearing about it, seeing about it. I would say across the board, they're disenfranchised because of the global systems that we live in now.
Sure.
But, historically, there were more of them.
I think that's so fascinating, so interesting. So how are you trying to kind of take what you have learned and channel that into what you're doing now?
Yes,
that's a big question.
It's a great question. And honestly, I'm still figuring it out.
That's fine.
That is my honest answer. But I am very focused on gender equity in general. I did a lot of research on gender quotas as well and their effect in increasing women's political participation in Africa and West Africa specifically. Ghana does not implement gender quotas, but many African countries do. And they are the ones that clearly have the highest rates of women in office. And so there's a lot of data to back that up. And what I was saying in my thesis is that's great. It's not a new technology. That was part of the traditional systems because you could have a woman chief, but no man's a queen. So that means that, if you're having a 1-to-1, if you're having one chief to one queen in every position, you at least have 50% women.
Right.
So to me, that is like the ultimate goal. I'm like, man, more gender quotas, like I want those here, but I know that's a hard push in the US for a lot of reasons. It's a hard push in Ghana now, but I'm getting involved in gender equity policy in other ways that I can. But really, feminism is for everyone, to quote Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
And it's such a direct transfer to what you were working on in Ghana, what you were researching in Ghana, and how you can apply it here, right? Where it's like, what was I going to do with this? Not that there's nothing to do, there's plenty to do, but like, how was this going to manifest? How was this going to kind of fit into my future doings? And it seems like you've found a good place.
Thank you. I feel like that just happened in the last 2 weeks, maybe. But I think a big part of that was too, during my thesis, I think I just really had kind of a vendetta about focusing on economics because I feel like that in and of itself is a very masculine thing in our world. There's so much else that brings value to something like cultural value, not just the money. But the world that we live in, I think I'm trying to start understanding more on a micro scale. Money is a direct representation of our values. So if we're paying more for one thing than another thing, we are directly valuing that thing more.
Yes.
So it's about where we place our value, what work is valuable and what's not. And I personally think our values are out of whack. So, I think that has been a big factor of why women around the world have also not been able to make it into top levels of leadership, because that directly translates to what do you have time to do? What do you have energy to do? You might be the best next president we could have.
Right.
But if you don't have the mental, emotional capacity to do that because the system is against you, you're not going to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, because it's not just about opportunity, right? It is having other factors in your life being taken care of, like men having women who are generally running their households and taking care of their children and taking care of their meals and whatever it is. And it's like, that's great that you work so hard, but you don't have to think about all of these other things in your life because she's doing them for you. And generally speaking, women don't have that counterpart doing the same things.
Right. My sister-in-law-ish. It's my sister's sister-in-law, but she's like my sister.
I love it.
Her. She's wonderful. She's run a cleaning business for many years. And she, at one point, was doing this awesome thing where she was literally breaking down what women were doing at home and saying, this is the monetary value of that.
Wow.
So that they could actually see, okay, yeah, I'm adding that much value to my family. If you had to pay for someone else to do all that housework and childcare work, that's how much you would be paying.
Yes.
And I think that that's huge, paid family leave, paid childcare. Again, where we put our money is where we put our values.
Yes, 100%. I have one question that I do ask everybody. So based on your experience, what you have walked through in your life, how do you view compassion through that lens?
That is a great question. And this is how my brain processes things. To think about this question as like, I need to look up the definition of compassion.
Yeah.
And I don't know that this is a good definition or not. This is what Google's telling me. But it says sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. I don't really like that definition.
I don't like that either. Ugh.
Right? But if I'm going off of that definition, I think in a way it's helpful because I wouldn't think of it really as pity, maybe concern, but more like I think of compassion as kind of like empathy, more like a feeling of someone else's feelings. Even if I can't understand, like if I'm in a room with an empath and I'm crying, they can feel that energy.
Yeah.
So some people are maybe more empathetic than others. So for me, that's more of what compassion is. But I think that this definition also kind of made me realize like, okay, but then if I'm looking at it through the lens of my experiences, compassion is a great thing to have, right? That's a skill that we can gain. We can gain the ability to be empathic. I think because it's active listening. You have to first be an active listener and learner, you know, and this goes into like putting yourself into someone else's shoes and trying to understand or feel what they're feeling, even if it's going to go away the next day when you go back to your regular life. Just try to get that perspective and like broaden your perspective. That's the first step. The next step is compassionate action. And I think that's what's really hard because, again, nothing's black and white. Things are very complicated.
Yep.
And I feel like that's where I am right now is like, I have learned so much and I'm in that stage of trying to integrate that into action that matters. Because I do have so much compassion for the people and situations that I've learned from in so many ways. And that's not just abroad. That's like my family and friends here too, right? Sure. But then trying to take all those experiences and all those perspectives and be like, what can I firmly stand behind, knowing that there are all these different perspectives on this, and then take action on that I think is going to be best for everyone at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. An allowance of different perspectives is always going to be, I think, the most compassionate choice because it acknowledges that we don't all have the same lived experience and that that's okay. And so, you know, you have to try to move forward doing your best, but ultimately the understanding that everybody's coming to life from a different place is important.
Yeah. And just different experiences. I mean, I think about this a lot, how like you could be very similar to someone and have very similar experiences, but still you'll never have all the same experiences.
Right.
Like everyone has a different perspective. I had to do like a compilation of notes and final assignment for my yoga teacher training. And I actually titled it My Personal Perspective because that's how I started viewing the world. And it's hard. Let me tell you, it's hard because I started viewing the world as like everyone's perspective is important. Oh gosh, I could go on to totally new things, but this comes into like objectivity and the difference between Western objectivity and Eastern objectivity, which I have learned about. And like, whereas objectivity here we think of as hard scientific fact.
Yeah.
I had a doctor of philosophy and yoga who I did a online course with explain it as in the East, we think of it as the meeting place or the union of all different perspectives, which is so different.
Yeah.
Right. So I've started trying to view the world like that and it complicates things. It's not easy, but also I feel like it's more beautiful that way.
Yeah.
Because it's more rounded and holistic and it's not black and white and it's not good or bad. It's like there's always more to learn. Everyone's perspective in the scenario counts. And my fellowship right now is a cohort of 8 people. So we have all these different placements, but we also have seminar days where we work together on projects or we interview people together. We do like a group interview of a leader in our country somewhere. And it's supposed to be a consensus-based group. It is hard on like a Friday evening when we all want to go home and they're like, you have to make a decision on this before you go, but you have to reach consensus.
Wow.
It's really tough. Feelings get hurt. And I think that that is the nature of doing this kind of work that considers all different perspectives. It takes time. We have to be more patient. We have to slow down. And we have to be willing to do the uncomfortable work.
Sure. Hey.
Yeah.
That's very true.
I struggle with it. I'm not perfect. Believe me. I've come back and like totally vented to my roommate. So yeah.
Gosh, yeah, that's a really difficult charge.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want that charge. So I'm going to leave that for you.
Okay.
You're doing a good job. Keep going.
Thank you. I'm doing a good job of talking about it. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of doing it, but I'm learning.
Hey, you're doing it. That is the work, right? So,
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. I just really want to thank you for doing this and for being open and vulnerable, and hopefully somebody resonates with your story, which I definitely think they will. Maybe someone will go join the Peace Corps.
Oh my gosh, totally. And, you know, if you want to reach out to me for advice, or if you're like, hey, you said the wrong fact about Peace Corps, I will be the first to be like, I'm sorry, I haven't done that job in a couple of months and I kind of forget. But also, thank you for doing this work.
Oh, thank you.
Seriously, I think it's really cool, and I'm really excited to listen to some of your other podcasts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to The Human Experience. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share it with others, and leave a rating and review on your favorite platform. Everyone has a story, and I'd love to hear yours, so be sure to check out the show notes for more information about how to stay in touch. Do good and take care.